So let's talk about assignment 2. You were asked to read the case of Patrick Donnelly and identify how he implemented each of the 8 effective mathematics teaching practices. The first effective practice was establishing mathematics goals to focus learning. Mr. Donnelly's goal was he wanted his students to understand that quantities that are in a proportional relationship grow at a constant rate. And there are 3 key strategies that can be used to solve problems like this: scaling up, scale factor, and unit rate. Mr. Donnelly wanted his 7th grade students to have a conceptual understanding of proportional relationships. But notice that his goal balances the conceptual understanding with the procedural fluency. The second effective practice is implementing tasks that promote reasoning and problem solving. So let's check out the task Mr. Donnelly selected. He used the candy jar task. It says a candy jar contains 5 Jolly Ranchers and 13 Jawbreakers. Suppose you had a new candy jar with the same ratio of Jolly Ranchers to Jawbreakers, but it contained 100 Jolly Ranchers. How many Jawbreakers would you have? Explain how you know. Mr. Donnelly implemented this task prior to teaching his students anything about proportions. So that means they also don't know anything about cross multiplication at this point. This task promotes student thinking. It's open-ended and allows students to solve the problem using any method that makes sense to them. And it's something that all students can do, even if that means drawing 5 Jolly Ranchers for every 13 Jawbreakers. Now let's look at the different solution strategies Mr. Donnelly's students came up with. Group 1 had a misconception that the relationship was additive. Group 2 used unit rate. Groups 3 and 5 used scale factor. Group 1, because they redid their work, along with groups 4 and 7, used scaling up with a table. And so did group 6. They just went about it a little bit differently. But look at group 8. They drew 100 Jolly Ranchers in groups of 5, and then they put 13 Jawbreakers with each group. Now let's talk about how Mr. Donnelly implemented and used this task in developing his students' understanding of proportional relationships. And as we do that, let's look for these 8 effective teaching practices. First of all, he had his students work with partners on the task. And while they were working, Mr. Donnelly walked around the room. He listened in on what they were saying and what they were doing. And he posed purposeful questions. How do you get that? How do you know that the new ratio is equivalent to the initial ratio? He also supported his students' productive struggle in the learning process. When students struggled, he pointed them back to the work they had done the day before, where they had produced a table of ratios that were equivalent to 5 Jolly Ranchers to 13 Jawbreakers, and a unit rate of 1 Jolly Rancher to 2.6 Jawbreakers. So not once did he tell his students how to do the problem. He did not take over the thinking for them, but yet he still supported them in their productive struggle. And as he was going around the room, he was making notes of the different strategies that students were using. He wanted to decide which groups he was going to have present and the order in which he wanted them to present. And he decided he wanted groups 4, 5, and 2 to share their solutions in that order. So let's go back and take a look at what those groups did. 4 was scaling up with a table. 5 used scale factor, and group 2 used unit rate. During the whole class discussion, as these groups were making their presentations, Mr. Donnelly asked the students to explain what their group did and why. This made visible their thinking, and then he used their thinking and invited other students to consider whether the approaches these students used made sense, and he also encouraged the class to ask them questions. Here we have a little excerpt from the whole class discussion, and if you notice, Mr. Donnelly uses purposeful questions to help generate this mathematical discourse. If you also notice that the students are participating in the mathematical discourse, Mr. Donnelly is facilitating it, but it's the students who are actually participating and discussing the meaning of these different representations. Oh, Mr. Donnelly is smooth. He's very strategic. Again, in the order that he presents, has students present, is for a purpose, so that he can develop their understanding and help them make connections between the different representations. Notice what he does here in line 49. So Jerry's group multiplied by 100, but Danielle and her group, group 5, multiplied by 20. Can they both be right? And through this discussion, he helps his students see the connections between those different solution strategies they came up with. But what's also important to note is Mr. Donnelly does not take over that conversation. He generates it with his questions, but he does not take it over and tell them exactly what they're supposed to know. And through this conversation, through his purposeful questions, he gets an idea of what his students are understanding about the mathematics. And as their exit ticket, as they're leaving, just before they leave, he gave the students group 1's misconception and asked them to decide whether or not that was a viable approach to solving the task, and then to justify their answer. He thought that would give him some idea as to whether or not individual students were understanding that ratios need to grow at a constant rate to be able to be proportional relationships. Well, that wraps up our assignment 2. Next up is assignment 3, your discussion forum. So make sure you post your discussion to the forum and then complete the assignment 3 forum verification.